So, this is Life's a Chore, an Overcooked style minigame in which the player must run around the level, completing all the tasks before the timer runs out. The player moves with WASD and interacts by tapping Y when in proximity to these different objects. So for the audio manager, I just made a singleton, and I did this because I knew there would only be one of these things. I wouldn't need the code to reference a whole other copy of the audio manager, so now it just references one. But here is where I keep all of the SFX and music. As you can see, I've made functions to store each of the SFX for the daytime ambiance and the nighttime ambiance. I also have different music that plays when you've won or lost. Moving on to the game manager, I also made this a singleton, as I would only need the code to be referencing this one thing. All of my front end menus are just game objects that I switch on and off by setting their active status to true or false. Here I have the array for the appliances and the level. This line of code here is just setting it to empty when the game starts instead of manually inputting all of my objects and the level into the array. It finds them and puts them there for me. I also did make a did player win bool that I set to false when the game starts. I made a is game running bool that just checks whether the game is actually running or not. That is used in a lot of ways, as you'll see later on, but it's at the top here because if the game is not running, then it should skip this entire function because the code below it does not apply if the game is not running. I've also got this all tasks done bool, which keeps track of the text prompts that have been completed. So this next snippet of code checks the array to see if each appliance has been completed, and if it finds all have not been completed, then it goes right back to the top of this if statement and checks it again. So if it does not move on from that if statement above, it goes on to this next if statement that says if all the tasks have been completed, then execute the end game win code, but if all the tasks are not done and the timer has run out, then execute the end lose code. This next function just starts the game if the button is pressed, so it has no references here because it's attached to the button in Unity. What this array at the bottom here does is it goes through the array, resetting every object for the next playthrough. Down here are some front-end menu stuff like the pause menus and tutorial screen and back button, the winning and losing screen as well. Here in the timer, I first established a float that will hold the current time and a float that defines the starting time that the clock will tick down from. This line here is to state that the current time is the starting time. In the update, I have an if statement that first checks if the game is running, and if it is, then the timer changes by how long the frame took. This way the in-game timer actually counts down by 1 second instead of every few milliseconds or however many it takes for the next frame to come in. In the next line, it converts it to a string so it can be displayed to the player as UI. Lastly, in this if statement down here, it checks if the current time is less than or equal to 0, then the current time should stay 0. It shouldn't tick down anymore or go into the negatives. Going on to player movement, we've got the first function, which just puts the player back to the starting position, so whatever position it was at the beginning of the game. Currently, I have the player starting in their bed, so she will always start in her bed. Next is the player movement. I've made it a vector2 function as it will just be referring to the x and y positions. The first line of code is just to set the vector to 0 to start out. I've made bools to define the key presses to make the if statements less complicated and generally more clean and easy to read. So here, if the up and down keys are pressed together, the player won't move up or down because I've set this vector to 0. However, if the player presses any one key at a time, it will increase or decrease by 1. This last bit of code for the animations to play, I've made the x-axis negative so that the sprite renderer flips. This makes it so the character looks like she's walking left or right, whereas before she just walked to the right no matter if you're going left. This return vector 2 here just sends it all back. In the update function, it's constantly looking for player input, and the code below it is just to reduce or increase the length of the vector to always be 1 instead of 1 and a little bit. This next function's if statement checks if the game is running, and if it is not, then the player does not move. It skips the rest of this function. But if the game is running, it goes on to the next line of code, which sets the amount you move every frame as the movement input times the speed of the character. So the player's movement speed is currently 5. Onto the player interaction, I first established a float that will store how many units away an object should be before the player can interact with it. In the update, I've got an if statement that just checks if the game is running, then skips the entire update function because the appliances should not be interacted with if the game is not started. This next if statement says that if the player presses Y, go into the array and check the position of the current object and the position of each object in the array. Vector2.distance calculates the distance between these two. If it is less than the units away, then the player can interact with it because it is within proximity. This then repeats for all objects in the array. It may be a little impractical to have the program check all of the objects in the array each time the player presses Y, but it was the solution I came up with, so it is the solution I used. Finally, we have the interactive object. When defining variables, I made an int that will store the number of times an object is interacted with. In the start function, I set this interact count to 0 as no objects will have been interacted with yet. This if statement says that if text prompts exist, then set the colors to red to indicate that it is not done. Then set the text to the first string in the array. It is the same scenario with the sprite renderer. Moving on to the interact function, I increase the interact count plus 1, so each time the player interacts with an object, the count will increase. This next line of code selects the number that is the smallest, so it doesn't grab a string or sprite that doesn't exist. So maybe the interact count is 6, but there is no 6th string or sprite in the array. The if statement below asks if the text prompt exists, and if it does, it gets the string or sprite in that current position in the array. The endTask function has an if statement that if the last string has been reached, the task is done. So this is referenced in the interact function to let the player know the text box or sprite is done changing. And that is it. That is all of my code. So this game connects to this year's theme of being human by showcasing some of the most human activities, chores, procrastination, bodily functions, and hobbies. My original idea for this game was a lot larger than it is now. It had a lot more functions. For example, I wanted it so the player could not only walk but run in short bursts. I had wanted E to be used as a tapping mechanic to interact, while Q required the player to hold down this button. I also had a lot of trouble with the player movement for a while. I had followed a number of tutorials that just kept breaking my game. I think I spent a lot of time on that could have been spent on other things if I had gotten it right the first time. I was never fully able to figure out how the SFX worked for individual elements such as buttons or interactions, so that never made it in. I wanted more UI involved in the interaction of objects, so bars that filled up or numbers that ticked down. I also wish I had a lot more time to make assets of my own and add more animations. If I had managed my time better, I probably could have knocked out one sprite a day, but as the theme goes, I am only human, so I procrastinated. However, I think I did very well, all things considered. I managed to complete a majority of the requirements for this project, and though it is a very simple game, I think it's got a lot of potential and personality. I'm also particularly proud of my front-end menu system. It took a lot of trial and error, but in the end, it's smooth and it does what it's intended, and narratively speaking, it ties in with the theme. I also stepped out of my comfort zone using a singleton for the first time. I wasn't sure if it was going to turn out okay, but it worked out perfectly in the end. Lastly, I'm pretty happy with the way the object detection worked. I've always really struggled with understanding and writing arrays, but with some time, help from teachers and peers, I got the hang of it and learned a new way of doing things.